All right, take 6. Hi, everyone. I'm Graeme. I'm a bathhouse worker in Toronto. And Tim, who are you?
Tim McCaskell, longtime bathhouse aficionado and gay activist about town, and was involved in the Coalition for COVID Safe Club Reopening, or Cocksucker otherwise.
Yeah. So to give a bit of background, we, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, bathhouses all around Canada, along with all kinds of other community spaces and businesses, closed in March 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as they began to reopen later that year, they had a pretty broad range of different safety measures that they put in place to mitigate the risk of COVID transmission. And part of why they had such divergent plans is because jurisdictions largely didn't seem to be developing guidelines for bathhouses. So they were coming up with safety plans based on recommendations that had been designed for hotels, bars, gyms, spas. In other words, all kinds of different spaces that are pretty different in that people don't primarily go to them to have sex with members of other households, hopefully several other households. So there's a pretty bit of a mismatch here between some of the guidelines that they were trying to follow and the reality of how we use these spaces, right? And myself and my coworkers saw that this caused some issues in other cities that we wanted to avoid in Toronto if at all possible. So in Montreal, bathhouses reopened in the summer of 2020, but they were met with some opposition within the community from people who worked elsewhere in the village or from gay health advocates who were concerned that the guidelines just weren't really credible, right? It doesn't really give you a lot of confidence necessarily if people are socially distancing when they're in line to go into a bathhouse, when you know they're not going to be socially distancing inside. And there haven't necessarily been like recommendations that are going to give people confidence that the risks are going to be as low as they can be, right? In November 2020, we saw that bathhouses in other Ontario cities, so Hamilton and London, were reopening again under guidelines that had not been developed for bathhouses. They've been designed for other businesses. And we realized that, we're not public health experts, but neither are our managers. If we were going to go back to work safely, we wanted to make sure that there were guidelines that were designed with these spaces in mind. And so then we sort of had this question of, where should those guidelines come from? Either the provincial government or the city of Toronto or Toronto Public Health. And we eventually decided that while Toronto Public Health doesn't have the formal jurisdiction to issue mandatory regulations, it has the expertise to issue recommendations that we could be confident in. And we also felt they'd be more responsive to pressure, given the composition of the Board of Health versus the people who are currently in power in Ontario. Myself and my fellow bathhouse workers had been laid off without the protection of a collective agreement because these aren't unionized spaces. So we needed allies to speak up alongside us. And so we reached out to both some customers who'd been involved in community health activism in the area, including Tim, including some doctors, some public health nurses, as well as to the AIDS service organizations who send staff and volunteers into the bathhouses for outreach, right? In too many other cities, bathhouses have reopened without those outreach services being available right away. And our stance was, well, if it's not safe for the ASO staff and volunteers, then how is it supposed to be safe for us, right? So we had some dovetailing interests here. So our overall strategy here was that if we got the AIDS service organizations and other allies to advocate for our shared interests, then the Toronto Board of Health would pass a motion calling on Toronto Public Health to develop COVID-19 guidelines for bathhouses because a majority of the board is responsive to the queer community and wants to have their support. And to give a quick rundown of how this went, we started out with drawing together a core team who'd work on the campaign, and we met with some of the people involved with men's outreach programs from 4 different ASOs in the city. We were able to come together with an open letter that was signed on to by ACAS, ASAP, and Black Cap. ACT was, well, someone from ACT was part of developing that letter, but unfortunately they didn't sign on to it in the end because they were reluctant to engage in a process without the bathhouse owners around the table. And our sense is that that would have prevented me and my coworkers from being able to speak openly in these spaces. So we decided to just go ahead without them, unfortunately. We also came out with an electronic petition that we garnered around 69 signatures before we first submitted it to the Board of Health at their next meeting. So once that petition had gone out along with the open letter, we were able to have a meeting with Toronto Public Health and some of the councillors, and their sort of stance is that, well, they thought that we'd be able to work this out with the operators, and they wanted us to see if we could do that before the Board of Health took any action. So we agreed, you know, didn't have our hopes up, but we agreed. We sent Tim to speak on our behalf in a meeting with the operators. And what they came back to us with was that they did not want to see any motion passed. They did not want to work with AIDS service organizations or Toronto Public Health to review their own safety guidelines. They did not want to have any guidelines developed for bathhouses. They wanted to reopen under the least restrictive guidelines possible. And they also didn't want us to do anything or talk to anyone without their approval. So we decided to ignore them and came back to the board after 2 months with more signatures in that petition. And we sort of changed tack here. We recognized that in May, the councillors, the elected representatives on the board, were still reluctant to take any action. They didn't want to bring the motion forward. So we looked at who else is on the board. Some of the public members on the Board of Health are health professionals, health researchers. So we drew together a new open letter from some of their colleagues. So we had around 12 like academics, practitioners from around the Toronto area, all with expertise in queer community health. After bringing that out, we reached out to one particular public member on the board, and she agreed to bring a motion forward, which was eventually passed at the June meeting. And Tim is going to talk a bit about what came out of this.
Okay, so first we got the motion from the Board of Health directing the medical officer of health to consult with stakeholders and community groups for guidelines, which is what we've been pushing for all along, because that was the kind of thing we needed to be sure that the conditions under which baths were opening were in fact safe for workers and for clients. Unexpectedly, the next time the provincial government came out with a reopening update, they specifically mentioned bathhouses, and we don't quite know how that happened. Their guidelines were, safety guidelines were specific to bathhouses and sex clubs, which was very welcome. I suspect that it had to do with the kind of kerfuffle that we were raising in Toronto, that they realized that bathhouses were an outlier in what they had published before, and that they had to be specific about this if they were going to really protect the public. There were a couple of things that we learned throughout this process. One of the most interesting was that there seemed to be a common perception that bathhouses, as is among the public, that bathhouses are some sort of illicit spaces and that we shouldn't talk about any kind of regulations for them, because if the government finds out about them, they're just going to try to close them down or something. And I found that especially interesting as somebody who was involved 40 years ago after the police raids on the baths, because then the perception in the community was these places are perfectly legal. They've been open for years. How dare the police come in and try to close us down? And so that shift in perception of the bathhouses as somehow being beyond the pale at this point in history is something I think we really need to think about and begin to figure out how that transformation has taken place. A second thing that we noticed was that the groups that garnered most petition signatures, that seemed to really go to work and try to mobilize people around this issue, were two that actually had not been involved in bathhouse outreach. Maggie's, which is a sex workers support group, and Toronto PWA Foundation. And so that was interesting, as well as this division between ACT and the other age service organizations. We're not quite sure what is going on there, but it's certainly something else we need to think about and investigate in terms of further campaigns. And the third, I think, was that the decision makers in government at the different kinds of boards really seemed hesitant to acknowledge that there were contradictory interests within the community. We talk about community all the time, but between workers and employers, we're not always on the same page. Sometimes even between institutions and people in the community, we're not always on the same page. And so what is the problem here that decision makers are having in terms of dealing with internal divisions within community? And I think that's a really important question, because we're seeing, as Toronto specifically becomes a much more divided city in terms of rich and poor, in terms of different racial and ethnic cultural groups, because of withdrawal of services and changes in taxes and all sorts of processes that are going on. Those divisions within the community are going to be more pronounced, and that decision makers are going to have to learn how to take them into account in terms of making decisions that in fact serve the most vulnerable groups in our community. So some questions for discussion. How should government and aid service organizations deal with these conflicting interests within our community? I think we really need to begin to think about that. Second, how can more vulnerable community members, for example, queer workers, sex workers, tenants, how can they have a voice in shaping state policy when the state seems to be much more comfortable in speaking to mainstream leaders and business organizations that don't necessarily reflect those kinds of communities? And finally, specifically, what role can aid service organizations play in this process? What are the barriers to them acting in solidarity with vulnerable community members and not trying to dismiss their concerns in terms of some romanticized notion of a community and that we're all in the same boat, because often we're not all in the same boat.
And that's our slideshow.
That's our slideshow. How long was that one?
Let's find